Joining us now to break down all the news of the week, Congressman Eugene Vindman, Democrat from Virginia. Thanks for being on the show this morning, Congressman. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me back.
What was your overall takeaway to Pete Hegseth's time on the Hill this week? Not just the war in Iran, which I know you questioned him over, but this $1.5 trillion budget proposal the Pentagon has put forward.
I would categorize it as smug irresponsibility, lack of accountability. The secretary came in a very partisan manner, was blaming Democrats for asking questions that we're supposed to ask as members of the House Armed Services Committee. Under the Constitution, we have an oversight obligation, responsibility to the people that we represent to ask tough questions about how we ended up in this war and what is our way out of it. And to me, it's very clear that we entered this war without a plan, and now we're kind of in a pickle because the Strait of Hormuz is closed. Gas prices, in fact, the day I was asking the secretary questions, had hit a 4-year high. They had only gotten higher now in the last couple of days. Oil prices spiked 62%. And not only is the Department of Defense paying more, but so are the American people at the pump. And so it's sort of a double whammy in that regard. And the secretary just did not have a good answer. In fact, the latest claim is that the ceasefire pauses the obligation of the administration to come back to Congress to seek an authorization to continue fighting. And a ceasefire is just that, ceasefire. It's a temporary halt to fighting, bombing, and it's nonsense. It's, again, a lack of accountability and unacceptable.
You know, the president's also contending that basically the military operation part of this is over, but we have this huge fleet out there, obviously, and, you know, we're still in the Strait of Hormuz. How do you see that comment? What do you make of it, and what do you make of its intent?
I don't see how it's over. The strait is not open. Traffic through the strait is only at 19% of what it was before the war. These are actually specific numbers I discussed with the secretary. And so a return to the status quo before the war would be, frankly, magnificent because right now the Iranians control the strait, and we've blockaded their ports too. So the traffic is just not moving, which means the 20 million barrels of oil that used to transit the strait, they're not getting on the market. And that's why we're seeing Americans and Virginians paying more at the pump. So, we've had a couple of false start attempts at a negotiation. Last weekend, the president canceled the travel, and I'm just not seeing sufficient movement. You know, we're involved in a fight. Obviously, we need to win it, but I just under the leadership that I'm seeing from the secretary here, and the fact that he said that he fully briefed the president on the potential risks, including the closure of the strait. The president approved that action, and so the president owns all the consequences at this point. So I just hope that there is a resolution. I'm just not very optimistic that we'll find one.
One of the criticisms Pete Hegseth has leveled at Democrats and the media writ large is that they're focusing on what they perceive as negatives of this conflict and not really telling the story about some of the positive things that have happened since the war began. So I'll just ask you, is there anything positive that has come of the last sort of 59, 60 days that the U.S. has been involved here?
Simply no. What we've been able to achieve is a very expensive mowing of the lawn, which is kind of a term that folks in the military community use. It's basically when terrorist or enemy activity reaches a certain threshold, you go in, you conduct strikes in order to tamp that down. We've damaged Iranian defense industrial base. We've taken out some of their missile and drone capability. But it's a country of 92 million people. They're actually highly advanced. We've lifted sanctions on oil for Iranians, so they're sort of raking in record profits. I think 14 billion was the last estimate, and so they will rebuild that. And what we've achieved in the end at this point, until we get a negotiated solution, is that the Iranians control the strait. There's been talk about them charging $1 million a boat to transit the strait. And so I don't see that as very positive. And I guess the last thing I'll say is that the secretary kept talking about Iranian nuclear capability. Under the previous leadership, the Ayatollah had issued a fatwa saying that they were not seeking a nuclear weapon. And we've conducted now 2 rounds of strikes between last year and this year. And so to the extent that they change that direction, it'll be based on the attacks that have occurred over the course of the last year, and to reestablish deterrence with the United States. So I just don't see much positive in the medium and long term at this point.
There's so much to talk about here. The president has said quite clearly Iran wants this thing to end. They're ready to negotiate. But then almost literally with the other breath, he said, but, we don't know who's really in charge, right? Who we're negotiating with. And if that's the case, how do you know that who you're negotiating with is going to create some sort of concrete outcome? And that's on top of the fact, I think it was a New York Times piece this morning, about the diminution of our weapons and our arsenal and the amount of money it's cost us and the possibility it leaves us vulnerable in some areas. So you can attack that from any angle you like, but I'll throw that at you.
Well, that goes back to the previous question, is like, what is the positive? We're depleting our arsenal. We have, exquisite weapon systems, but they're a finite number of them right now. It takes a long time to rebuild that arsenal, the munitions catch, and it just puts at risk other areas of the world where we have equities. So I think the estimate now that we've spent $25 billion on the war is very much on the low end. The comptroller is lowballing that figure. I think there are estimates that go as high as $65 billion. And that's enough to fund Medicaid and Medicare. Actually, Medicare, the cuts that were in the big ugly bill last year for a year or two at least. It's enough to pay for education for millions of Americans. It's enough to pay for infrastructure. And ultimately, this was a war of choice. And so I think whenever we go into a conflict like this, and this is a major war, much more significant than Venezuela, there are trade-offs. And national security is a critical element. That's the world I come from, 25 years in the Army and the National Security Council. And so I take that obligation, that responsibility very seriously. But there are also people that are suffering in America's streets right now that having trouble with housing, with healthcare, with just making ends meet and affording gas. And I don't know that, I don't believe that this conflict, that the president never laid out a case ahead of time, never went to Congress for an authorization for, didn't do the work to build a coalition of willing countries to assist, has gotten us in a very good position.
So the DHS shutdown is over. Folks are going to get paid. I'm curious, moving forward, Republicans are going to fund ICE and CBP, try to fund it by themselves without any Democratic support. They're going to do other things through reconciliation. What do Democrats gain by basically not being a part of this process at all?
But look, this is simple. First of all, the DHS funding, we could have had the same resolution weeks ago. Right? We had a package come over from the Senate weeks ago under unanimous consent. We had an opportunity to vote on it. It would have received bipartisan support if it reached the floor. And ultimately, this was a war of choice. And so I think whenever we go into a conflict like this, and this is a major war, much more significant than Venezuela, there are trade-offs. And national security is a critical element. That's the world I come from, 25 years in the Army and the National Security Council. And so I take that obligation, that responsibility very seriously. But there are also people that are suffering in America's streets right now that having trouble with housing, with healthcare, with just making ends meet and affording gas. And I don't know that, I don't believe that this conflict, that the president never laid out a case ahead of time, never went to Congress for an authorization for, didn't do the work to build a coalition of willing countries to assist, has gotten us in a very good position.
So the DHS shutdown is over. Folks are going to get paid. I'm curious, moving forward, Republicans are going to fund ICE and CBP, try to fund it by themselves without any Democratic support. They're going to do other things through reconciliation. What do Democrats gain by basically not being a part of this process at all?
But look, this is simple. First of all, the DHS funding, we could have had the same resolution weeks ago. Right? We had a package come over from the Senate weeks ago under unanimous consent. We had an opportunity to vote on it. It would have received bipartisan support if it reached the floor, and instead, a group of hardliners held it up, and so they're causing more damage, more harm to the American people. DHS not getting paid, Coast Guard bills. There was actually an article about Coast Guard being $300 in the hole on debts for utilities and other things. For what reason? It's just a further demonstration of the sort of the chaos, the inability to rule that my Republican colleagues have demonstrated when they have the House, the Senate, and the White House. And as far as the ICE and DHS funding goes, I mean, we have very simple, very reasonable requests, demands that ICE and CPB abide by the Constitution, treat Americans with dignity and respect, that when they're executing their law enforcement function, that they're not masked like every other law enforcement entity in the country under normal circumstances. And they're refusing to abide by those or even negotiate on those requests. So, I mean, when it's a take it or leave it and the deal's a bad deal, I'll leave it every day, all day.
Congressman, we only have less than a minute, but I have to ask you about redistricting. We know in Virginia, we're still waiting to hear from the Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court of Virginia, but our national Supreme Court made that huge redistricting decision the other day, which is going to give a lot of help to Republican states. Do you think this makes the Democrats more vulnerable, and what do you think about it generally?
I think it just reinforces the foresight and the leadership of Virginians in choosing to redistrict. Had we not moved forward with redistricting last year, and then obviously the vote that took place just a few weeks ago, I think the Virginians would have been in a much worse position, and the Republicans are maximalist in their rigging of the system. And Virginians fought back, and so I'm very proud of the role of Virginians and Virginian political leaders displayed in this fight.
All right, we will have to leave it there on a Friday morning. Congressman Eugene Vindman, we appreciate